Chapter 3, Part 2 of Christian Non-Resistance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 3, Part 2 of Christian Non-Resistance in all its important bearings, illustrated and defended, by Aidan Ballou. Objection 4. Death of Ananias and Sapphira. The sudden death of Ananias and his wife Sapphira, for a deception practiced on the apostles, in keeping back a portion of their estate for private use, while pretending to consecrate the whole to the use of the church, seems to have been virtually an infliction of capital punishment. Is this reconcilable with your non-resistance? Answer. The death of those persons is not represented as the act of the apostles, or as in any manner procured or occasioned by them. It is recorded as the visitation of God, without any curse, imprecation, or wish of men. This will more fully appear from the record itself. But a certain man named Ananias, with Sapphira his wife, sold a possession, and kept back part of the price, his wife also being privy to it, and brought a certain part, and laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why hath Satan filled thy heart to lie to the Holy Ghost, and to keep back part of the price of the land? While it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was it not in thine own power? Why hast thou conceived this thing in thy heart? Thou hast not lied unto men, but unto God. And Ananias, hearing these words, fell down and gave up the ghost. 3 hours later, when his wife, not knowing what was done, came in, Peter said unto her, How is it that ye have agreed together to tempt the Spirit of the Lord? Behold, the feet of them which have buried thy husband are at the door, and shall carry thee out. Then fell she down straightway at his feet, and yielded up the ghost. Acts 5, verses 1-5, 7-10. Is there any intimation in this account that Peter, or any of the other apostles, assumed judicial authority over those persons? Or that they assumed any power, human or divine, over their lives? Or that they caused, occasioned, imprecated, or desired their death? Certainly not. The case, then, is not one on which the objection can pertinently rest. I therefore dismiss it. Objection 5. Human government, 13th Romans, etc. Human government is recognized in the New Testament as the ordinance of God for good to mankind. Rulers are declared to be a terror, not to good works, but to the evil, ministers of God, and revengers, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil, who bear not the sword in vain, and ought to receive tribute, custom, and honor at the hands of Christians, not only for wrath, but also for conscience's sake. Paul pleaded his citizenship as a Roman to obtain an honorable discharge from prison, and on another occasion to save himself from the scourge. He applied for military protection to save his life from the 40 conspirators, and appealed to Caesar to obtain justice in his defense against the accusations of the Jews. See Romans 8, verses 1-7, Acts 16, verse 37, Acts 22, verses 24-29, Acts 23, verse 17, Acts 15, verses 10-12, Titus 3, verse 1, 1 Peter 2, verses 13-14, and other passages. Now, as human government, in all its various forms, with its military and penal terrors, is the ordinance of God for good to mankind, as its rulers are declared to be the ministers of God for the protection of the innocent and the punishment of the guilty, and as its requirements are to be respected with submission, it follows that Christians, instead of non-participating therein, on account of war, capital punishment, and penal inflictions, ought to share in its responsibilities, and be its firmest supporters, always conscientiously endeavouring to render it in the highest degree efficient for its divinely appointed purpose. Here, then, is an insuperable objection to your doctrine of non-resistance, certainly so, as respects government, war, capital punishment, etc. Answer. This is by far the most plausible and seductive objection now urged against Christian non-resistance. It deceives and misleads more good minds, and is harder to be answered than any other. And yet it is essentially fallacious and invalid. This I will endeavour to demonstrate. Government is the bond of social order. It is that directing and regulating authority which keeps individuals in their proper relations to each other and the great whole. The intelligent Christian must contemplate it in three several characters. 1. Government per se. 2. Government de jure. And 3. Government de facto. Government per se is authority exercised to maintain and promote moral order. Moral order, of course, presupposes rational social beings. When such beings are in a state of true moral order, they are right-minded, and being right-minded, gradually reduce all things physical to the right condition. Mind governs matter, and moral authority governs mind. Moral order involves all other order. Imperfect moral order leaves all things in a state of imperfect order. Moral disorder draws after it all manner of physical disorder. Therefore, all depends on a supreme moral authority or government. This must be inherently divine. It is original and self-existent in God only. Government per se, then, is essentially divine. It is of and from God. It is not original in any created being. Wherever it exists, it is derivable from God. If so, there is, strictly speaking, no such thing as human government. Man is always subordinate to God, and can have no right to enact any law, or to exercise any governmental power contrary to the divine law and government. If human nature possessed original independent governing authority, men could rightfully repeal or nullify the divine law. Now they cannot. Consequently, all law and government absolutely contrary to the law and government of God is morally null and void. But all law and government, in accordance with the divine law and government, is morally binding on every human being. This presents government in its second character, government de jure, or of absolute right. That all human governments ought to be conformed to the standard of the divine, none will deny. If they were thus conformed, they would cease to be human in their spirit and character. They would become mere incarnations and elaborations of the divine. But as the word human, when joined to the word government, may imply nothing more than a human manifestation, in a well-regulated social organization, I will not discard its use, my meaning being understood. I will say, then, that Christian non-resistance, so far from conflicting with the government per se, or human government de jure, i.e. human government strictly subordinate and conformed to the divine government, holds the first supremely sacred, and the last as its grand desideratum. And on this very account, it requires the disciples of Christ to keep themselves disentangled from all such human governments as are fundamentally repugnant to the divine government. All such as are not de jure, according to the law of God declared by Jesus Christ. This brings into view the third character in which non-resistants are obliged to contemplate government, viz. Government de facto, as it is in fact. And what has human government ever been in fact, from the beginning to this day? Has it been identical with the divine government? Has it been radically government de jure, according to the law of the living God? Is the present government of the United States, with all its captivating professions and really good things, fundamentally a Christian government? Who will dare to say so? What then was human government de facto in the apostolic times? The government of Herod, Pilate, Nero, and the Roman Caesars, under whom oppression, injustice, tyranny, and cruelty rioted on human rights, deluged the habitable globe with blood, crucified the Son of God, and made myriads of martyrs? Now, a preliminary question to be settled is, whether the Apostle Paul, in the 13th chapter of Romans, speaks of government per se, or of government de jure, or of government de facto. If only of the first or second, then is there no incompatibility of his words with non-resistance, and the objection falls to the ground. But if he speaks of human governments and rulers, such as they were in the Roman Empire, further investigation will be necessary to set the subject in a true light. I will take for granted that he was speaking of the governments and rulers under whom Christians then lived, for I can suppose nothing else. How the apostles viewed the then existing governments. Taking this ground, we wish to know precisely how he and the other apostles viewed those governing powers, and how they counseled the disciples of Christ to feel and act with regard to them. If Christ and his apostles regarded the Caesars and their subordinate kings, governors, and magistrates as moved and approved of God, as his conscious ministers in carrying on the government of those times, if they really held the then existing governments of the earth to be ordained of God, in the same sense that their own spiritual, religious, and moral authority was, then is the objection before us unanswerable. Then, of course, I must admit that it is the duty of Christians to share in the responsibility of any government under which they may live, and to support its requirements in all things, war, capital punishment, persecution, idolatry, slavery, and whatever else it may exact. It would then be God's own law and voice, to be obeyed implicitly in all things. There could be no limitations or exceptions. Did the apostles teach such doctrine as this? If they did, how happens it that they and the primitive Christians kept themselves so scrupulously aloof from the governments of their times? No, the objector will not contend for any such unqualified endorsement of human government by the apostles. He will disclaim such extreme conclusions. He will admit the gross corruption, tyranny, and wickedness of those very governments which Paul declares to have been ordained of God. He will admit more than I shall stop to demand, of horrible impiety, iniquity, and persecution on the part of those very rulers, whom the apostle declares to be the ministers of God, avengers to execute wrath on evildoers. He will not argue that such governments as those of the Herods, the Pilates, and the Neros were ordained of God, in the same sense that the Church of Jesus Christ was. Not that those bloody-minded rulers and their agents were ministers of God, consciously and approvedly, as were the apostles. He knows that Paul never intended to be so understood. Here, then, is the mischievous little catch of the objection. Words and phrases are taken in a false sense. There is a sense in which it is true that there is no power but of God, in which the powers that be are ordained of God, in which rulers, even the worst of them, are not a terror to good works but to the evil, in which they are the ministers of God for good to the righteous, and the avengers to execute wrath on men of violence. Respects wherein government is ordained of God. I come then to the following conclusion. 1. That government of some sort supplies a fundamental want of human nature, and must exist wherever men exist. In this respect, it is ordained of God. 2. That human governments de facto are barbarisms, corruptions, perversions, and abuses of the true government de jure, which God through Christianity aims to establish among mankind, and are therefore the nearest approaches which the mass of men in their present low moral condition are capable of making to the true ideal. In this respect, government is ordained of God. 3. That the worst of governments are preferable to absolute anarchy, being the least of two evils, and rendering the condition of man on the whole more tolerable. In this respect, the powers that be are ordained of God. That human governments generally proclaim and sanction some great truths and duties, execute some justice, and intentionally maintain more or less wholesome order. That they are in many respects positively good in motive and deed, thus far conforming to the divine government. In this respect they are ordained of God. 5. Wherein human governments and their administrators are fundamentally tyrannical, selfish, oppressive, persecuting, unprincipled, and morally aberrant, they are overruled in the hand of God, as unwitting instrumentalities for the punishment and restraint of violence, and for quickening and purifying the moral sense of the righteous, to superinduce in them a holier, more devoted, and mightier activity in the great work of human reformation. In this respect, the powers that be are ordained of God, and rulers are administrators of God for good to the just, but of wrath to the children of wrath. Therefore Christians are to respect, submit, and render homage to the governments and rulers under whom they live, however anti-Christian and even persecuting, taking care to obey them in all well-doing, to conform to their requirements in all matters not conflicting with the divine requirements, differing from them as peaceably as possible, suffering their wrongs patiently in hope, withstanding them only for righteousness' sake in things absolutely sinful, and then enduring their penalties with non-resistant meekness and submission. But at the same time, they are to be true to the kingdom of God, faithful in their allegiance to the great law of Christ, never departing from it for the sake of assuming the reins of any human government, or obtaining its honours, emoluments, advantages, approbation, or protection. If they can enter into any government and carry their Christianity with them unadulterated and untrammeled, let them enter. If not, it is their imperative duty to remain out of it, peaceable, unoffending subjects. Their mission is a higher and nobler one than that of the worldly politician, statesman, or ruler. They must not desert, betray, or dishonor it. If they continue faithful, they will gradually draw up human government to the divine standard. If they lower themselves down by renouncing or compromising their principles, for the sake of participating in any fundamentally anti-Christian government, hoping thereby to elevate the moral tone of such government, they will infallibly be disappointed. They will sink themselves, and with them the government will sink still lower than before. They must everlastingly insist on the principles and precepts of Jesus Christ, and whatever will not come to those, leave to it its own genius and doom. God will take care of all the rest. For there is no power but of God, and subject to his own sovereign disposal. The Christian has nothing to care for but to be a Christian indeed, allowing himself never to be transformed into anything, or committed to any undertaking essentially inconsistent with his sublime profession. If I have taken a correct view of this important but difficult subject, I have fairly removed the pending objection, so far as it rests on the 13th chapter of Romans, and similar passages. I am confident this view is substantially correct, and I do not believe the opposers of Christian non-resistance can give any other view which will harmonize decently either with the plain tenor of the Scriptures or with their own doctrine, respecting the nature and functions of civil government. It remains only that I touch on that part of the objection which asserts that Paul in certain cases reported to human government, idolatrous, warlike, and despotic as it then was, to secure immunity, protection, and justice. Paul's conduct in relation to government. This is a misapprehension, or at least a false view of the facts. Did Paul ever commence a persecution at law for the redress of injuries perpetrated on his person, property, or rights? Did he ever apply to the civil or military authorities for personal protection, when at large, pursuing his usual avocations? Never. Such a case is not on record. The cases cited all occurred when he was a prisoner, in charge of the government officers. The first instance is mentioned in Acts 16, verse 37. Paul and Silas had been thrown into prison and cruelly beaten by orders of the magistrates of Philippi. The next morning those magistrates sent directions to the jailer to let them go. But Paul said unto them, They have beaten us openly uncondemned, being Romans, and have cast us into prison. And now do they thrust us out privily? Nay, verily. But let them come themselves and fetch us out. The result was that the magistrates, knowing that they had proceeded unlawfully, were glad to acknowledge their error, and discharge the prisoners in honorable manner. This was all Paul demanded. He and Silas had done nothing, even according to the laws of the land, to merit such vile treatment, and knowing that they had a right, as Roman citizens, to redress, they meant that the magistrates and the public should understand the facts. They, however, brought no action for redress, but were content to forgive their injuries, if only they might be regarded as the injured party, and as such reputably discharged. This is just what every non-resistant ought to do under like circumstances. It would have been unworthy of the gospel for Paul and Silas to have crept off in a private manner, leaving the people to infer that they were culprits, allowed to escape by mere indulgence. Christianity is as bold, faithful, and heroic in asserting its rights and sustaining its just reputation, as it is non-resistant in respect to returning injury for injury. It is never mean and skulking, but always open, frank, dignified, and godlike. The next instance cited is mentioned in the 22nd chapter of Acts. The Jews had raised a mob and rushed on Paul to kill him. While they were cruelly beating him, the chief captain came upon them with his soldiers, and made Paul his prisoner, causing him to be bound with 2 chains, and to be conducted to the castle. Having reached the stairs of the castle, he asked permission to address the excited multitude. He was permitted, and was heard for a short time with great attention. But on declaring that God had commissioned him to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, the whole throng broke out into the most furious invectives, saying, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. And as they cried out, and cast off their clothes, and threw dust into the air, the chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle, and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. This was an extraordinary state of things. An innocent man falsely accused and maliciously assailed by a crowd of bigoted and ferocious Jews, solely on account of his Christianity, was about to be cruelly scourged to extort a confession of some suspected secret. Paul, being a free-born Roman citizen, and knowing himself privileged by that single fact from such gross outrage, demanded, as they were binding him with thongs, Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is Roman and uncondemned? This stayed the proceedings instantly. Take heed, said the centurion to the chief captain, what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. Tell me, art thou a Roman? Said the captain. Paul said, Yes. The captain answered, With a great sum obtained I this freedom. But I was free-born, replied the prisoner. Then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him. And the chief captain also was afraid, after he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. Here was one remarkable excellency of the Roman law and authority. A Roman citizen must be treated with a certain degree of respect, and fairly heard in his own defense, even though guilty of great crimes. He must be regularly condemned before being subjected to the treatment of a felon. This was nothing but a dictate of plain justice and common sense. But observe, Paul had not recently gone and purchased his privilege of Roman citizenship in order to provide against such contingencies as these. He was freeborn. All he did was to remind those who were about to violate the Roman law by scourging him uncondemned of his rights. He threatens nothing. He only throws upon them their own responsibility. It was his right and privilege to be dealt with civilly, till fairly tried. He pleaded his rights in the most unassuming manner possible, and left those who had his person in their power to act for themselves. How just, how honourable, how meek, how noble, how non-resistant was his conduct! There is nothing in which any non-resistant, in like circumstances, might not and ought to copy. The next instance followed soon after. It is recorded in the 23rd chapter of Acts. Paul, still a prisoner in the castle, had received a partial hearing before the chief priests and their council. Meantime, 40 of his most violent enemies banded together under oath not to eat or drink till they had killed him. To find an opportunity for their deadly assault, they agreed to request the chief captain to bring Paul again before the council for further hearing, intending while he was imperfectly guarded to rush upon him and effect their purpose. Paul's sister's son, getting knowledge of this conspiracy, communicated it to his uncle, who thereupon called one of the centurions and said, "Bring this young man unto the chief captain, for he hath a certain thing to tell him." The young man did his errand to the chief captain, who kindly sent him away under a charge of silence respecting the matter. To prevent bloodshed and all further violence, the chief captain ordered 460 of his soldiers to convey Paul, during the night, to Caesarea, to Felix the governor. Thus was the threatened mischief avoided. This is what some understand to be Paul's application for a military force to protect his person. Did Paul apply for protection? Did he demand a military escort? Did he ask anything, or recommend anything, except barely that the centurion would conduct his nephew to the chief captain, that he might communicate his message? No, nothing. He was a helpless prisoner, guarded by the chief captain's soldiers. It was the duty of that officer to afford him such personal protection as was due to all Roman citizens. Paul knew from his preceding conduct that the chief captain was desirous of discharging his duty according to law. He was apprised of the deadly conspiracy formed against him. Had he been his own man, non-resistance would have admonished him to escape the danger by flight. But he was a prisoner. He was to be brought within reach of his foes under treacherous pretenses of a desire to give him a further hearing, and then murdered in spite of his Roman guard. What could he, or ought he to have done, either to save his own life, or pay proper respect to the chief captain, less than to cause the simple facts to be communicated? Nothing. It was his duty. He would have been most criminal had he done otherwise. He meditated no counter-attack on the guilty. He sought no means of punishing them. He counseled no measures of violence. He recommended nothing, threatened nothing, demanded nothing. He caused the proper information to be conveyed to the captain, and meekly left all to his discretion. And the captain proved his good sense, as well as pacific disposition, by so disposing of the prisoner as to prevent all violence and danger. In all this matter Paul acted just as any Christian non-resistant in such circumstances should act, most unexceptionally. His appeal to Caesar followed in the train of these events. It is mentioned in the 25th chapter. What was the nature and design of that appeal? He had been falsely accused, subjected to a long imprisonment, and partly tried for heresy and sedition. His trial was still pending, after a 2 years' delay of justice. Festus, the new governor, found Paul still in bonds. The high priest and chief of the Jews now moved their suit afresh, and requested that Paul might be sent to Jerusalem, lying in wait in the way to kill him. But not succeeding in this plot, the Jews went down to Caesarea to renew their accusations before the governor's judgment seat. Paul reaffirmed his innocence of all their charges, and nothing could be made out against him. Festus, the governor, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, asked Paul if he would go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of those things. Then, said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender, or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof they accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar." How noble and Christian-like this appeal! Jerusalem was no place for an impartial trial. It was only adding insult to injury to propose under such circumstances pretexts to take him back among those prejudiced and bloodthirsty men. If he must be further tried, he claimed his privilege to appear before a higher and more impartial court, to go to Rome. God had directed him in a vision to do so, for the purpose of proclaiming the gospel in that great city. His defense was in fact nothing but the defense of the gospel. He, therefore, appealed to Caesar. He was not the accuser but the accused. He had not come into court to complain of and procure the punishment of his enemies. He was not the prosecutor in this case, but a prisoner, falsely accused, detained in bonds unjustly, and now laid under the necessity of going to Jerusalem or to Rome for the conclusion of his trial. He might have his choice. It was his acknowledged privilege, and he availed himself of it as a duty to the cause of Christ, no less than as a right. And in this, as in the other instances, he acted just as he ought to have acted, just as any Christian non-resistant would be bound to act. Neither of the cases cited implies the slightest inconsistency of conduct with the doctrine to which they are brought as objections. Conclusion. Having thus thoroughly canvassed all the important objections to my doctrine, which I recollect ever to have seen presented out of the Scriptures, I may now confidently appeal to the understanding and conscience of the Christian reader for a favourable verdict. Have I not triumphantly demonstrated that the Holy Scriptures teach the doctrine of non-resistance as defined in the first chapter of this work? Have I not fairly answered the objections urged from the Scriptures against it? Is there any doctrine or duty taught in the Bible which can be sustained by more convincing testimony, or that can be more satisfactorily freed from objections? It seems to me that candid minds, after seriously investigating the subject, can come to no other conclusion. I know that it is a momentous conclusion, drawing after it the most radical change of views, feelings, conduct, and character throughout Christendom and the world which can well be imagined. But will it not be a most glorious and salutary revolution, when all who sincerely reverence the Bible, as in any sacred sense the Word of God to mankind, shall contemplate the Old Testament as the prophecy and preparative of the New, pointing forward to the perfect development of moral excellence under the reign of Jesus Christ? When they shall see his precepts, examples, and spirit, a perfect manifestation of the divine wisdom and goodness, and shall feel that his righteousness, imbibed into the hearts and exhibited in the lives of mankind, is the only remedy for all the world's disorders. Fly swifter round, ye wheels of time, and bring the welcome day. End of chapter 3, part 2.